My name is Claire Maddox. I'm 38 years old. I'm a certified forensic audio analyst at a private evidence consulting firm in Portland, Oregon. My job is to listen to things that other people cannot hear. Distorted recordings, degraded audio, voice identification, authenticity verification, background noise isolation. I work with defense attorneys, federal prosecutors, insurance investigators, and civil litigation teams across the country. I have testified as an expert witness in 41 cases in 11 states. Judges read my methodology into the record. My reports have been cited in appeals courts in 3 jurisdictions. I have spent 14 years building a professional reputation for precision and objectivity that my supervisor, Margaret, describes without irony as borderline obsessive. I hear what is there, not what someone wants to be there, not what the narrative requires, what is actually measurably acoustically present in the recording. That is my standard. That is my discipline. I built that discipline deliberately, and I built it specifically because of what I did when I was 22 years old. When I was 22 years old, I sat in a courtroom in Deschutes County, Oregon, raised my right hand, and told a jury of 12 people that I recognized my brother's voice on a 911 recording made on the night of a murder. I was certain. I had grown up with that voice for 18 years. I knew my brother's voice the way you know the sound of a door in your own house, the specific weight and pitch of it, the particular way it moved when he was trying to sound calm and was not calm. I testified that the voice on the recording was his. The jury believed me. My brother, Daniel Maddox, was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 22 years in the Oregon State Correctional Institution. He was 28 years old. He had been telling me since the night of his arrest that he did not do it. He told me from the holding cell and from the defense table and from the prisoner transport van and from every letter he sent me for the first 2 years of his sentence before I stopped being able to read them. He said, "It was not me, Claire. I did not do this. I believed I knew better. I believed I had heard his voice on that recording. I believed I had done the right thing when I drove to the police station instead of turning toward the gas station where he was waiting for me. I believed all of that for 16 years. Last month, my supervisor dropped a case file on my desk, a voice identification review on original 911 evidence from a 2009 Deschutes County homicide case. She did not know my connection to it. I looked at the case number. I sat at my desk for 4 minutes. Then I went to her office and closed the door and told her everything I had never told anyone. Then I went back to my desk and opened the file and did the work I should have done 16 years ago. I'm going to tell you what I found, but first I need to take you back to Bend, Oregon, June of 2009. The night my brother called me from a gas station payphone, and I chose the police station over him. The night that cost him everything and cost me everything too, in this specific way that being wrong costs you slowly every day for a very long time. Before I do, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story genuinely connects with you. Drop a comment and tell me what time it is where you are. I always love seeing where you're all listening from. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Let me tell you about Daniel Maddox. Not the version the prosecution built for the jury in 2009. The version assembled from bar fight records and unpaid invoice disputes and a wall with a dent behind a picture frame. The real version. The version I grew up with, because this story does not make any sense unless you understand who my brother actually was and why I loved him and why, on the worst night of both our lives, I made the choice I made. Daniel was 6 years older than me. He was the first person I remember clearly, before my parents even, because he was the one who was always there when I was small, carrying me around on his back, making up voices for my stuffed animals, teaching me to ride a bike in the parking lot of our apartment complex on a Saturday morning when I was 5 and he was 11 and our parents were still asleep. He was tall and thin, with our father's dark eyes and long hands that were always doing something, building or fixing or taking apart something he wanted to understand. He had a laugh that filled rooms. He had a temper that emptied them. Both things were true, and both things were completely his. He did not apologize for either of them, and he did not pretend to be something he was not. which was the quality I admired most in him, and the quality that cost him the most consistently throughout his life, because the world does not reward people who do not perform their own innocence convincingly. He dropped out of high school at 16, not because he was not intelligent, but because the specific structure of high school, the sitting still and the following instructions and the performing engagement with material he had already taught himself, was something his brain rejected the way a body rejects the wrong blood type. He got his GED at 18, took community college courses for 2 years, and dropped out when a construction job came along that paid well and felt real in a way that classroom learning never had. He was good at the work, physically good at it, strong and precise, and strategically good at it. The kind of worker who could look at a project and immediately see the sequence of steps that would get it done most efficiently. His boss at the first construction company he worked for, a man named Pete, who is still in Bend and who testified for the defense in Daniel's trial, said Daniel was the best young worker he had seen in 20 years of the business. Not the strongest, not the fastest, the best because he thought before he acted and because he cared about doing the thing right, not just done. He was also bad with money and bad with authority and cycling through jobs and apartments and relationships in the way that smart, restless people do when the world has not yet found the correct container for them. He had a misdemeanor assault charge from 2007, a bar fight in which he broke a man's nose after that man said something about our mother that I will not repeat because it does not need to be repeated, only understood. He paid the fine and did community service and never spoke about it. He put his fist through a wall in our parents' house when he was 19 after a fight with our father about something I never fully understood, some accumulation of smaller things that finally had to go somewhere. The wall. My parents covered the hole with a picture frame of me at my kindergarten graduation. That picture frame was still there the last time I went home before Daniel's arrest, which I know because I looked at it and thought about that wall every single time I walked past it for years. The man who was killed was named Robert Fitch. He was 41 years old, a residential property developer in Bend, who had a documented history of disputes with contractors over payment, a pattern that investigators were aware of but had not acted on because disputes over payment are civil matters, and civil matters are not criminal until something changes. Daniel had worked for Fitch on a renovation project in the spring of 2009. He had done the work correctly and on time, and Fitch had paid the first 3 invoices and then stopped returning calls. The final 2 invoices totaled $14,200. For Daniel, who was living in a 1-bedroom apartment and driving a truck with 160,000 miles on it, $14,200 was not an abstraction. It was 4 months of rent and a truck repair and breathing room that he had earned by spending 8 weeks working a property he had been promised he would be paid for. He called Fitch 12 times over 6 weeks. He went to Fitch's office twice and was told he was unavailable. He filed a small claims notice and was told by the court that the amount exceeded small claims limits and he would need to pursue civil litigation, which required an attorney he could not afford. By June of 2009, Daniel had been trying to get his money for 2 months and getting nowhere, and the anger in his voice every time we talked about it had been building in the specific way his anger built, steadily, without release, like pressure in a pipe that nobody has opened a valve on. On the evening of June 14th, he drove to Robert Fitch's house on Cascade Avenue. He told me later in the letters I eventually read that he had not planned to do anything except talk to him face to face and make clear that he was not going away. That is consistent with who Daniel was. He did not threaten people. He showed up. He confronted. He used his voice and his presence and his absolute refusal to be dismissed. And it worked often enough that it was his default approach to situations where he had no other options. What happened at the house that night, I have pieced together from Daniel's accounts, from the investigation, and from what I now understand about the timeline. Daniel arrived at Fitch's property at approximately 9:15 p.m. The front of the house was lit. He rang the doorbell and knocked. No answer. He went around to the side gate, which was unlocked. He went into the backyard and saw a light in the office window and knocked on the glass. No response. He climbed back over the fence, catching his left hand on a wire, which produced the cut that the prosecution presented as evidence of a struggle. He was in the backyard of Robert Fitch's house for approximately 12 minutes. During that time, he says, he heard a sound from inside. Something falling, he thought, or something being moved heavily. He did not know what it was. He did not go inside. He left. He walked 2 blocks to the gas station on Miller Avenue, and he called me from the payphone at 9:47 p.m. because his cell phone was dead, and he needed a ride, and he was shaken, and he did not know what he had heard inside that house, and he needed his sister. At 9:47 p.m., someone also called 911 from that payphone. The call lasted 41 seconds. The caller said there had been an argument at the house on Cascade Avenue. The caller said someone might be hurt. The caller did not give a name. Robert Fitch was found dead in his home office the following morning by his assistant. A single blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Time of death estimated between 9 and 11 p.m. The murder weapon was never found. There was no blood on Daniel's clothing. There was no physical evidence placing him inside the house. What there was a 911 recording and a 22-year-old woman who told a jury she recognized the voice on it. That woman was me. Isal, I need to tell you exactly what happened inside my head on the drive between my apartment and that gas station on Miller Avenue on the night of June 14th, 2009. Not because it excuses anything. There is no excuse. But there is an explanation, and the explanation matters because it is the mechanism by which innocent people go to prison. Not through malice, not always, but through the specific catastrophic failure of a person who loves someone and is afraid of them at the same time and lets the fear speak first. Daniel called me at 10:23 p.m. I was at my apartment, 22 years old, finishing the last month of my junior year at the University of Oregon. I was studying communications with a focus on audio technology. I had been listening to recordings and analyzing them as coursework for 3 years. I was not a forensic analyst. I had no formal training in voice identification methodology. I had no understanding of the scientific literature on ear witness testimony reliability. What I had was 18 years of listening to my brother's voice and the absolute certainty in that moment before I thought about anything carefully that I knew it the way I knew my own. He said he needed help. His voice was high and fast, scared. I said I was coming. I hung up, and then I drove south on I-97 toward Miller Avenue, and somewhere in that drive in the dark, something shifted. I thought about the bar fight. I thought about the wall. I thought about the escalating anger in his voice every time he talked about Fitch over the past 2 months, the way the pressure had been building without release. I thought, he was at the house tonight. He told me he was going. He was at the house and something happened, and now he is at a gas station calling me, and his voice sounds like that. I thought about what it would mean if I turned toward Miller Avenue and I found him there and I looked at his face and I knew. I thought about what I would have to do with that knowledge. I thought about what it would mean to know and to say nothing. I was 22. I was sitting in a car on a dark road, and I was building a story in my head from 3 facts. My brother was angry. My brother was at the house. Something happened at the house. I built the story before I had the facts to build it from, and then I drove past the Miller Avenue turn and went to the police station instead. I told the officer at the desk that my brother Daniel Maddox might have been involved in something at a property on Cascade Avenue. I gave his name, his phone number, his description, the address of the gas station. Then I sat in the parking lot and waited. He was arrested at 11:02 p.m. I watched the police cruisers go past on the street outside the parking lot, and I told myself I had done the right thing. If he had done nothing wrong, the police would determine that. The truth would protect him. I told myself this with the confidence of a person who has not yet learned what truth costs in a system that is not designed for complexity. The truth did not protect him. I protected his conviction, because 2 weeks later, I sat in a courtroom and the prosecution played the 911 recording and asked me if I recognized the voice. And I said yes. I said it was Daniel. I said it with absolute certainty. The jury believed me because I believed myself. I believed myself because I had driven past that gas station on Miller Avenue, and I needed the story I had built in the car that night to be the correct story. I needed to have been right, and I testified my brother into a 22-year sentence because I needed to have been right. Daniel looked at me from the defense table when I said it. He had been watching me since I took the stand. He did not look angry. He looked at me with an expression I have spent 16 years trying to describe accurately. It was not betrayal exactly. It was something quieter and more specific. It was the look of a person who understands exactly what is happening and knows there is nothing he can do to stop it and is watching it happen anyway because there is no other option. He shook his head once, just slightly, just enough for me to see. I looked away. I did not look at him again during the rest of the trial. I could not. The day the verdict came in, I was in the parking lot of the courthouse, and I heard someone come out behind me, and I turned, and it was Daniel's public defender, a young man named Andrew, who looked as destroyed as I felt. He said, "He asked me to tell you that he forgives you." I said nothing. I got in my car and drove home, and I sat in my apartment for 3 days and did not speak to anyone. And then I went back to my final exams because that is what you do when you have built a story that requires you to keep moving. I graduated from the University of Oregon in 2010 and enrolled immediately in a graduate program in audio forensics at a program in Seattle. My undergraduate advisor had recommended it based on my work in her acoustic analysis courses. She said I had a natural ear for it. She meant it as a compliment. I heard it as something else, as an indictment and an instruction at the same time. You have a natural ear for it, then learn to use it correctly. Learn what you did not know at 22. Learn the methodology that would have told you the truth if you had known to apply it. I enrolled. I studied. I became the best student in the program because I could not afford to be anything less. I want to tell you what I learned in those 2 years and the 12 years of professional practice that followed, because it is the core of what happened to my brother and why it should not have happened and why it happens to other people and will keep happening until the legal system understands what the scientific community has been saying for 30 years. Ear witness testimony, which is the technical term for what I gave at Daniel's trial, a lay listener identifying a voice from a recording, is one of the least reliable forms of evidence in forensic practice. The research on this has been consistent and clear since the 1990s. Studies using controlled conditions have found that even people who know a voice extremely well, spouses who have been married for decades, parents identifying their own children, siblings who grew up in the same house, perform at accuracy rates only modestly above chance when asked to identify voices from short or degraded recordings. The reasons for this are understood. Stress changes vocal characteristics. Acoustic environments change frequency content. Recording equipment introduces distortion. Playback equipment introduces additional distortion. And the human auditory system, unlike a spectrometer, does not measure. It interprets. It filters incoming acoustic information through existing knowledge, expectation, emotional state, and need. What we hear is not a neutral recording of acoustic reality. It is a construction assembled from the sound and everything else we bring to the listening. I had brought to that courtroom 18 years of knowing my brother's voice, 3 weeks of building a story about what he had done that night, and the specific psychological need of a person who had driven past the gas station instead of stopping and needed that decision to have been correct. I heard what I needed to hear. The jury heard what I told them I heard, and my brother spent 16 years in a cell telling the truth in a building where nobody had the tools to verify it. Daniel wrote to me for the first 2 years of his sentence. Long letters, careful letters, the handwriting large and slightly slanted the way it always had been because he had never been taught to hold a pen correctly and had never cared to change. He wrote about the daily structure of prison. He wrote about the other inmates he had met. He wrote about books he had read. He had always read more than people expected, and he wrote in every letter something about the case. Not accusatory, never accusatory, just insistent. The way a person insists on a fact that is true, regardless of whether anyone is listening. It was not my voice, Claire. I was standing at that payphone waiting for you. I called you at 10:23. The 911 call was made at 9:47. I was not there at 9:47. Find the phone records. Check the timeline. It was not my voice. Niai stopped responding after 2 years because reading his letters while doing nothing about them was a specific kind of pain I did not have the capacity to carry while also building the career and the life I was building. That is not a justification. It is what I did. I stopped responding and I buried it the way you bury things that are too heavy to carry in the open, under the daily structure of work and study and professional achievement. And I told myself I would act when I was ready, and I was never ready, and the years went by. And I had one phone call with Daniel in 13 years. His birthday in 2013. I called because I could not call on his birthday. He picked up on the first ring and said my name, and the sound of his voice on that call, live, direct, undistorted by a tape copy played through a courtroom speaker, hit me like a physical thing. I knew immediately, in the animal way that you know things before your brain has processed them, that I had been wrong, not suspected, knew. The voice on the 911 recording and the voice saying my name through that phone were not acoustically identical. I felt it before I could explain it. I said, Daniel, I know. He said, do something about it, Claire. I said I would. I said I was working toward it. He said, I've been working toward it for 4 years, every day. What are you working toward? I did not have an answer to that question. I said I was sorry. He said, I know, that's not enough, you know that. I said yes. He said, happy birthday, and hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time, and then I went back to work. I wrote him a letter in 2019, 10 years into his sentence. I told him I was sorry. I told him I had been wrong. I told him I was now a forensic audio analyst, and that I had the skills and the methodology to properly analyze the 911 recording, and that I believed the result would be exculpatory. He wrote back within a week. He said he had been waiting for that letter for 10 years. He said he was not angry at me. He said he needed me to understand that his not being angry was not permission for me to feel better about what I had done. He said, like, find the recording, run it properly. Take the result to whoever needs to hear it. Don't wait until you feel ready, because you are never going to feel ready. You know that. Do it anyway. I said I would. 2 more years went by. I did not do it. I was a coward. I am capable of saying that clearly because it is true, and because Daniel spent 16 years telling the truth when nobody was listening, and the least I can do is match that standard now that someone is. I was a coward for 16 years, and the cowardice had a specific shape. I was afraid of what it would do to my professional reputation to disclose publicly that I had given false testimony in a murder trial. Not intentionally false, but false by every measure that matters. And I was afraid of the legal consequences. And I was afraid of the personal reckoning of standing in a courtroom and saying out loud what I had done and why. Like, I prioritized those fears over my brother's freedom for 16 years. I want to be honest about that, because this story is not a story about redemption earned through heroism. It is a story about a person who was wrong and then was slowly, inadequately, but finally, too late, less wrong. The file arrived on a Monday morning in late October. My supervisor, Margaret Chow, came to my office at 9:15 with a manila folder and a coffee and her standard Monday expression of organized calm, and said she had a new contract from the Eugene Innocence Project, a voice identification review on original 911 evidence from a 2009 Deschutes County homicide. She said it was a straightforward methodology assessment. Original recordings versus trial testimony determine whether the identification methodology used at trial met current forensic standards. Write up the findings. She set the folder on my desk. She went back to her office. I looked at the folder. I looked at the case number. I felt something that was not quite fear and not quite recognition, but somewhere between those two things, like the feeling of walking into a room where something important happened before you arrived, and the air still holds it. I sat at my desk for 4 minutes and 8 seconds. I know the exact time because I was watching the clock on my computer screen. Then I got up and went to Margaret's office and closed the door. I sat down across from her and I told her everything. All of it. Daniel and the bar fight and the wall and the gas station and the police station and the drive I had made that night. The trial, my testimony, the letters I had not answered, the phone call on his birthday, the letter in 2019, and the 2 years that followed it in which I did nothing. I told her all of it in the order it came out, which was not organized or structured, and Margaret sat across her desk and listened to all of it without moving. When I finished, the office was very quiet. The sound of the office outside the closed door was very far away. Margaret looked at me for a moment. She said, "How long has it been?" 16 years, I said. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Can you run this analysis without bias?" I said I could run it without bias. And I said I was the most qualified analyst on staff for this methodology, and that the analysis would be documented, co-signed, peer-reviewed, and court-ready, regardless of the result. I said I needed to do it. I said that doing it was the only thing I had not done yet, and I had run out of ways to justify not doing it. Margaret looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Full protocol. I'll co-sign the methodology. You tell me immediately when you have a preliminary result." I said yes. She said, "And Claire." I looked at her. "I'm sorry this took 16 years to get here." I said, "So was I." I went back to my desk and opened the file. The original 911 recording was a WAV file, uncompressed original dispatch system archive quality. The Innocence Project had obtained it through a public records request after the trial court declined to re-examine the evidence under the original motion. It was the source file, not a copy, not a tape conversion, significantly cleaner than what had been played at trial 16 years earlier. I loaded it into my analysis software and looked at the waveform for a moment before I ran anything. 41 seconds. A male voice, regional accent consistent with Central Oregon. The words I had been told for 16 years were my brother's words. I ran the first analysis, spectrographic decomposition, the visual map of the recording's frequency content over time. I looked at it without comparison first. Then I loaded the reference sample, a recording of Daniel's voice from a prison intake interview conducted in 2010, 1 year into his sentence, which the Innocence Project had obtained from the Oregon Department of Corrections. Standard protocol. I ran the same spectrographic analysis on the reference sample. I placed them side by side on my screen. I have been looking at spectrograms for 14 years. I have compared hundreds of voice samples in that time. I know what a match looks like. I know what a non-match looks like. I know the specific visual language of acoustic similarity and acoustic difference, and the threshold measurements that distinguish one from the other in a legally defensible analysis. I looked at the two spectrograms side by side on my screen for approximately 45 seconds before I ran the formal comparative measurements, because looking is not measuring, and I wanted to see first with my trained eye before I applied the instruments. Then I ran the formal analysis, fundamental frequency range comparison, formant frequency mapping across the vowel sounds in both samples, F1 and F2 trajectory analysis, articulation rate measurement, fricative consonant acoustic profiling, long-term average spectrum comparison. I ran each analysis twice, documented every parameter and measurement, noted every result. It took 4 hours and 23 minutes. At 2:17 p.m., I looked at the complete comparison data. The voice on the 911 recording and the voice on Daniel's 2010 intake interview had divergent fundamental frequency ranges, divergent F1 and F2 formant patterns across all measured vowel sounds, divergent articulation rates outside the normal within speaker variation range. acoustic profile differences in the fricative consonants that exceeded the threshold for same-speaker identification, as defined by the standards published by the International Association for Identification and the guidelines of the Scientific Working Group for Speaker Identification. The recordings were not from the same speaker. The voice on the 911 call was not my brother's voice. It had never been my brother's voice. I had sat in a courtroom at 22 years old and told 12 jurors that it was his voice, and I had been completely, documentably, scientifically, irreversibly wrong. I sat at my desk with the comparative data on my screen, and I thought about Daniel at the defense table shaking his head. I thought about the letters I had not answered. I thought about the phone call on his birthday in 2013 and his voice saying, "Do something about it, Claire." I thought about him in that cell for 16 years, telling the truth to people who did not believe him. Then I called Margaret. She came to my office immediately. She looked at the data. She looked at my face. She said, "I'll call the Innocence Project." Then she said, "Wait, call your brother first." I called Daniel. He picked up on the second ring. He said my name. I said Daniel. I said I ran the analysis. He said, "What did you find?" I told him. He was quiet for a long time. A long time. Long enough that I said his name twice. Then he said, "I know." I said, "I know you know." I said I was sorry. He said, "I know that too." Then he said, "How long have you known you were wrong?" I said, 10 years. He was quiet again. Then he said, "Okay, that was all. Okay. The single word a person says when the thing they have been waiting for finally arrives and everything that comes after it is still too large to hold." Oh, the Innocence Project filed for post-conviction relief on a Tuesday in November, 22 days after I submitted my analysis report. The report was 47 pages. Full spectrographic analysis, formant frequency comparison tables, articulation rate measurements, long-term average spectrum data, expert conclusion with confidence assessment, and full methodology citation. Margaret co-signed the methodology section. The Innocence Project's lead attorney, Patricia Voss, 20 years of wrongful conviction cases, read the full report in one sitting and called Margaret at 9 p.m. the same evening. She said it was the most thorough and court-ready voice analysis report she had received in 20 years of practice. She said the prosecution was going to find it very difficult to challenge the methodology. Margaret said that was the intention. The hearing was set for January, but in December something happened that none of us had anticipated. The Innocence Project ran parallel investigative work while the legal motion was proceeding, which is their standard practice because audio analysis is one piece of evidence, and evidence cases are strongest when multiple pieces point in the same direction. Their lead investigator, a former detective named Marcus Webb, who had been doing innocence investigation work for 12 years, followed up on an anomaly in the original police report. The anomaly was this. The 911 call had been logged at 9:47 p.m. from the payphone at the gas station on Miller Avenue. Daniel's call to me had been logged at 10:23 p.m. from the same payphone. The prosecution had argued at trial that Daniel had made the 911 call anonymously and then waited at the gas station, which was consistent with the 36-minute gap. The defense had argued that the gap proved nothing because Daniel had arrived at the gas station after the 911 call was already made. The jury had sided with the prosecution. What Marcus focused on was the pay phone itself. The gas station had changed ownership in 2011 and been sold again in 2016. The third owners, a family who converted it to a full-service convenience store, had found a cardboard box in the back office during renovations that contained archived security footage tapes from the previous owner's system. They had kept the box because they did not know what to do with it, and throwing away security footage felt wrong. The box had been sitting in a storage unit for 9 years. Marcus found the storage unit. The family gave him access. On the tape from June 14th, 2009, beginning at 9:41 p.m., there was footage of the exterior of the gas station, including the payphone on the left side of the frame. The footage was grainy, the camera was not positioned directly at the phone, and the timestamp on the tape had drifted from the actual time by approximately 4 minutes, which Marcus calculated by cross-referencing the tape's recording of a truck that appeared in a sequence that could be independently verified through the truck's GPS data, which the trucking company still had in their archive. Adjusted for the timestamp drift, the footage showed a man using the payphone at approximately 9:47 p.m. The man was not Daniel Maddox. He was approximately the same height and had similar dark hair and a similar build, similar enough that at a distance or in poor light or through the lens of an existing expectation, you could confuse them. But he was not Daniel. His face was partially visible in 2 frames. Marcus compared those frames to every individual connected to Robert Fitch, who had been interviewed during the original 2009 investigation. He found the match. On the 14th comparison, a man named Terry Bowen, 44 years old, in 2009, who had worked as a bookkeeper for Robert Fitch's property development company for 3 years and had been terminated 3 weeks before Fitch's death. The termination had followed an internal audit that found Bowen had been processing unauthorized expense reimbursements through a vendor account he had access to. The total amount was approximately $9,000 over 18 months. Fitch had terminated him and told him he would not pursue criminal charges if Bowen did not contest the termination. Bowen had agreed. He had been interviewed by police in the original investigation as part of the routine financial background check on Fitch's associates and had been eliminated as a suspect because he had an alibi. He said he had been home alone the evening of June 14th, and there was no evidence to contradict that at the time because the security footage in the storage unit had not been found. Marcus brought the footage and the comparison photographs to Patricia Voss on a Thursday evening in December. Patricia called the Deschutes County District Attorney's Office the following morning. I want to tell you how the voice comparison completed the picture. Marcus obtained a sample of Terry Bowen's voice through an interview conducted under a pretext investigation, legal in Oregon with the appropriate documentation, and sent it to my firm. I was not permitted to run the analysis personally due to my ongoing conflict of interest in the case. Margaret ran it, Bowen's voice, and the 911 recording. She sent me the results as a professional courtesy the same afternoon. Fundamental frequency range within the same speaker threshold. Formant frequency patterns consistent. Articulation rate within normal within speaker variation. Long-term average spectrum consistent. Margaret's conclusion, stated with high confidence, the voice on the 911 recording from June 14th, 2009 was consistent with the voice of Terry Bowen, not Daniel Maddox. Never Daniel Maddox. Terry Bowen had called 911 after leaving Robert Fitch's house. He had reported what he had done, or what he had seen, or both, in the specific way that people sometimes call emergency services after committing a crime because the knowledge of it is too heavy to carry alone for even 41 seconds. He had not given his name. He had waited 16 years for anyone to listen carefully enough to identify him. Nobody had listened carefully enough. Not until the right recording landed on the right desk at a firm in Portland with the right person to open it. What? The January hearing lasted 4 hours. Patricia Voss presented the audio analysis, the security footage, the voice comparison on Bowen, the new investigation findings, and the timeline inconsistencies in the original investigation. The prosecution had 48 hours to review the materials before the hearing, and their response was muted in a way that told everyone in the room everything they needed to know about the strength of the case against Daniel. The judge granted an interim release pending a full evidentiary hearing and ordered an independent forensic review of all audio evidence. Daniel was released on a Thursday afternoon at 2:30 p.m. I drove to the Oregon State Correctional Institution in the morning, and I parked in the visitor lot, and I waited. I had brought nothing. I had thought about bringing something like flowers or food or some object that could stand for everything that did not have a physical form, and I had decided against all of it because nothing I could bring to that parking lot was adequate, and pretending otherwise felt wrong. I just drove there and I waited. Drove there, and he came through the gate at 2:47 p.m. He was wearing the clothes he had been wearing the night he was arrested, which the facility had returned to him in a plastic bag as standard procedure. Jeans and a dark green jacket and boots. He had been 28 years old in those clothes. He was 44 years old wearing them now, and they fit differently on a body that had lived 16 additional years inside them. He stood at the gate for a moment and looked at the sky. Not dramatically, not for effect, just the way a person looks at something they have not seen freely for a very long time. Then he looked at the parking lot, and he found me. He walked toward where I was standing. He stopped in front of me. I said his name. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he put his arms around me, and I held my brother in the parking lot of a prison in January, and I cried the way you cry when you have been carrying something for 16 years, and you are finally allowed to put it down. You are finally, not because anything was resolved or forgiven or made right, because he was out, because he was standing in the cold air with his arms around me and the sky above us and the parking lot around us, and he was out. And I was the person who had helped get him out, and none of that undid anything, but all of it was real. He pulled back after a moment and looked at me. He said, "You got there, Claire." I said, "I know." "Not fast enough," I said. He said, "No." He looked at me in that direct way he had always had, the way that made it impossible to add any softness to what he was saying. "Not fast enough," he said, "but you got there." Then he said, "I want a burger." I said, "Okay." We got in the car, and I drove to a restaurant near his temporary housing that the Innocence Project case manager had recommended, and we sat in a booth by the window and ordered, and Daniel talked about the burger for 4 minutes when it arrived, the specific qualities of it, the bun and the sauce and the ratio of things, with the kind of focused attention that a person gives to small pleasures when they have been without them long enough that small pleasures are not small anymore. I listened to all of it. I listened to his voice describing that burger, and I heard every frequency of it, every acoustic detail, the voice of my brother, alive and present and outside a cell in January in a restaurant with a window, and I did not say anything because there was nothing to say that was worth interrupting that sound for. Terry Bowen was located in Boise, Idaho in February. He had been living there under a variant spelling of his name for 9 years. He was arrested on a Friday morning and extradited to Oregon. He was charged with the 2009 murder of Robert Fitch. His attorney entered a not guilty plea. The case is ongoing. I have been subpoenaed as an expert witness for the prosecution to testify about the audio analysis. I will also testify at the request of the Innocence Project and with the agreement of the prosecution about my original ear witness identification and what I understand now about why it was wrong. I will sit in a courtroom in Deschutes County, the same county where I testified against my brother, and I will explain to a jury exactly how a frightened 22-year-old woman who grew up with a voice can hear what she needs to hear instead of what is there. I will do this on the record, in public, with my name attached to it. Patricia told me I did not have to. She said my expert testimony on the audio analysis was sufficient. I said I understood. She said, "Why do you want to do the personal part?" I thought about Daniel in that parking lot looking at the sky. I said because my brother spent 16 years in a cell telling the truth and nobody believed him. The least I can do is spend an afternoon in a courtroom doing the same. Daniel's formal exoneration hearing is scheduled for March. The civil case against Deschutes County is being handled by the Innocence Project's litigation team. Daniel said he did not care much about the money. I told him to let the attorneys handle the caring about the money because that was their job, and his job was to figure out what 16 years of his life was worth and let a court put a number on it, even if the number was not adequate, which it would not be. He said that was fair. He has been relearning things, how to use a smartphone, how to make decisions about what to eat and when to sleep, and what to do with a morning that nobody else has scheduled. He called me last Tuesday to describe a burger in detail again, a different restaurant, same level of 4-minute analysis. I listened to the whole thing. I will always listen to the whole thing. I'm not going to tell you that this story has a clean ending. It does not. Daniel lost 16 years. He lost the specific years between 28 and 44, the years when a person builds the version of their life they will live in for the rest of it, the career and the family, and the decisions that accumulate into a shape. He will not get those years back. No exoneration gives them back. No civil judgment gives them back. The Innocence Project's case manager told Daniel in their first meeting that the reintegration process for exonerees is harder than most people understand because the world has kept moving and they have not. And the gap between those two things is not bridged by compensation or legal vindication. It is bridged by one day at a time for as long as it takes. Daniel said he had some experience with that. She said she imagined he did. What I will tell you is what I know professionally and what I know personally and how those two things have ended up after 14 years in the same place. Professionally, ear witness testimony is unreliable. The studies are clear. The methodology is settled. The forensic standard has been established, and courts that allow it without expert scrutiny are making a mistake with documented consequences. Personally, I know exactly how I was wrong. I know it with the precision of someone who spent 14 years building the tools to measure it. I heard what I needed to hear. I needed the story I'd told myself in that car on the night of June 14th to be the correct story. I needed my brother to have done what I thought he might have done because the alternative was that I had driven to the police station and told them his name and set everything in motion for no reason at all. I could not hold that possibility, so I made it impossible by testifying it away. I did not lie. That is the part that I have found most difficult to explain and most important to say. I was not lying. I was completely, sincerely, devastatingly wrong. That is how this happens. Not through malice, through certainty, through the specific failure of a person who hears what they need to hear and calls it testimony. My grandmother used to say, "The truth does not need anyone to believe it. It just needs someone to say it correctly." I did not say it correctly for 16 years. The recording sat in an evidence archive for 16 years, being exactly what it was, a voice that was not my brother's, waiting for someone to listen to it with the right tools. Last October, someone dropped it on the right desk. I am not a person who believes in fate or meaningful coincidence as a governing principle of the universe. I believe in acoustic data and documentation and evidentiary methodology, but I also believe that the truth has a particular persistence. It does not require you to act on it. It just stays there in the recording, in the archive, in the 41 seconds of a phone call made from a gas station on Miller Avenue at 9:47 p.m. on June 14th, 2009, waiting. It waited 16 years, longer than it should have waited. But it waited. And when the right person finally listened the right way, it said exactly what it had always been saying. Have you ever been completely certain about something that turned out to be completely wrong? Has someone you love ever told a truth that nobody believed until it was almost too late? Tell me in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one, every week. And the ones that stay with me, I carry with me.